You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Welcome back to another episode of the Max Planck Lawcast. Before we begin today, I feel it's appropriate to provide a brief warning about the content of the episode. Today's discussion will include topics concerning anti-Semitism, racism, and violence in Nazi Germany. Some individuals may understandably find this episode distressing, and listener discretion is therefore advised. With that being said, when it comes to images of World War II, there are many, many terrible ones out there of death and destruction. In a conflict that laid waste to huge areas of Europe and Asia and resulted in the death of more than 50 million people, numerous war crimes were perpetrated, particularly by the Axis powers. Yet, in all this suffering and carnage, there was kind of some semblance of ordinary life which continued on the home front. And on today's episode, I'm being joined by Lara Bucholski to talk us through about what life for women and children looked like in Nazi Germany. In addition, Lara will tell us more about how the German government reformed marriage and education after the war, looking not only at which elements were removed, but at which elements were retained. There's plenty to talk about today, so Lara, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I forgot actually in the introduction there, I forgot to mention that you are from the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and Private International Law in Hamburg, right?
Exactly.
Okay, well, I'm sitting roughly probably 1,800 kilometers down further south in the Black Forest. So it's definitely great with modern technology bringing us together today. And that kind of gets me to my first question, actually, as a nice segue from modernity to present to past. I'd like to begin by looking at the present and ask you why you in the 21st century are researching family and marriage from a period almost 80 years ago?
Yeah, it is a valuable question and a good question. So everything kind of started out last year, well, it was 2022, when the German Judiciary Act was changed and Section 5A was amended, that now the critical reflection of the injustices of the Nazi regime, so Nazism, National Socialism, and also those of the SED dictatorship are compulsory requirements of the legal education today. And last year, I was still working at a university, and my Professor Röthe, who's now heading up the Max Planck Institute here in Hamburg as well, she was teaching a class on family law, and she asked me to do some research on the impacts of the Nazi regime and National Socialism in marriage and family law at that time. And from that, it kind of evolved for me to be like, okay, this is a really interesting topic. I don't know anything about it, and I have finished my studies. And from there on, it kind of evolved, and I stuck with it. And I find it really interesting and then also important just to point that out, especially as a legal scholar and lawyer in the future, just how law can be impacted by ideology and how civil law and the law of the ordinary daily life can be impacted by ideology and these kind of terrible atrocities and mindsets.
Right, so this has kind of piqued your interest. You kind of unwittingly stumbled onto the topic, and you're continuing now with your research on that.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, right. Well, you've obviously now spent a lot of time with the topic, so I'm going to ask you a fairly sweeping question, but maybe you can give us a quick overview of the Nazi Party's views concerning the role of family.
Yeah, for sure. So one has to understand or just keep in mind that at the center of Nazi ideology is the subordination of the individual under the Volk, which I, during this episode, translated for German people or the people's community. And the main objective, obviously, from the Nazi leadership was to preserve and strengthen these people's community. And it was the ruling thought that common good over self-interest, and from a legal point of view, that went as far as that the private autonomy that we take for granted today was only seen as a means to an end to achieve that people's community and the folk as a whole. And marriage and family hailed a service character of a higher order under these social construct and under this idea of a people's community. So family was seen as the nucleus of clan and the people, and marriage had its only purpose in the production of offspring. Hitler himself said of marriage that the service is propagation and preservation of species and race. It was really clear that family marriage, they were functions. There weren't really social concepts more than they had this is an instrument for us to work on our ideology and to achieve the goals we set as National Socialists do.
Okay, so a very, very different approach to marriage and family in today.
Yeah, for sure. The purpose was common goal and not the individual interest of having a family and personal relationships. It was very much straightforward function, produce offspring, raise offspring. Yeah.
Okay. You said Adolf Hitler obviously had these views there himself, but did all these ideas stem from him? Or was there a single defining doctrine, or was this a system that was built up over time?
It was a system that was built over time. The ideology and the views can be found in the party's program early on, and also obviously Hitler's own propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, it was also built up as an instrument. It wasn't really clear, this is how we as a Nazi see it. It was more how do we achieve our common goal? Okay, we need family and marriage to do these certain things and be these certain institutions and take up these roles and functions.
It was kind of the entire state apparatus, if you will.
Hitler sold the German people an idea, or his worldview. That's everything. If you look into how it was structured back then, you can clearly see that everything revolved around Hitler's persona and his worldview. So he then explained how this would be achieved. And these ideologies were then brought up from the ground up, basically.
Okay.
So he went first with the parties and then interest groups. And then there were other people propagating his ideas. But everything was more or less this is what we need to do. There was a lot of we as a whole need to work on that to achieve this idea. And the idea was a better Germany after the big inflation, the Wall Street crashes, and the regression at the end of the 1920s.
Certainly. Okay. You've said now, we've talked about now where the ideas stemmed from, I guess, from Adolf Hitler and him passing them along to the German populace bit by bit. Who, though, was responsible for administrating these views on marriage?
Yeah, good question. So on one side, it was a social or a society thing to give these ideas just to your next neighbor. So it started from the ground up. There were interest groups, there were schools, propaganda was aimed just in the ordinary life to this is what we need to do, as I said before, but also the law took a really slow approach as well. Since that's my focus of research. So first you can see a reinterpretation and reassessment of the pre-existing law in the daily life by lawyers, judges. You can see that the Nazi ideology and the worldview becomes a legal argument. There is a primary of völkischem Verständnis, which is the ethno-nationalistic understanding or the ethno-nationalistic point of view the Nazis portrayed and tried to implement. And that kind of reigned supreme within the application of law and within the jurisprudence in general. So the law developed a value-based jurisprudence where it is said to be free from the corset of positive law, but bound only by ideology. So this was the way we practice law changed completely. And then later, obviously, legal institutions were tasked with rewriting law. Just to point one out, it was the Academy for German Law, which later brought us the marriage law from 1938. But these slow approach of just reinterpreting existing law, that was really astonishing for me to see, and to just see that neutral law or law that had been existing prior to the regime were just used in a completely different sense and could be used in a different sense without further ado, with just saying, hey, this is what we do now. This is the values we put at the bottom of our decisions. And from this on out, this is how we have to read the law. And yeah, that was really interesting to see.
To see how a system can be used within the boundaries of the created for that system to change and alter the way law is understood, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It was a major shift. So while in the beginning, these laws were seen as opportunities for equality and justice, they were now used for inequality and injustice just by, just by changing the point of view going into the legal discussion.
Yeah. Well, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, though, I guess I'm acutely aware that the episode today has a lot of ground we want to cover, and we're not going to be able to talk about it all. So I propose that we break the episode down into two parts. The first one looking at more closely at women and marriage in Nazi Germany, and the second one looking a little bit more closely at children and their education. Does this work for you?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Well, then let's begin with women in Nazi Germany. The title of today's episode is Kinder und Küche, which is German for children and the kitchen. Would you consider this an appropriate summary of what was expected of women in Nazi Germany?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Okay. Good to know, good to know.
Yeah, really spot on. Yeah, so just to jump right in. So motherhood, being a mother, being a housewife, that's the general idea. And that actually was a big contrast to the path women's and equalities and women's rights had been on before. So before, during the Weimar Republic, the role of the women in Germany was actually progressive in Europe. So they had the right to vote. The German Civil Code from 1896 firstly recognized the parental right of the woman without just seeing it second. Well, it was still second to the fathers, but generally the woman had her own parental right.
I see, understood.
And it wasn't just the fatherly right to bring up the children. Women were in politics. They were steps in legal, like in women's educations, and they entered the workforce. So how did the shift happen? Women being back in the kitchen, being just tasked to raise children. That was really interesting to see how that worked, because it worked rather smoothly. Okay.
What would you say, what led to this smooth shift then? Was it propaganda that led to this? Was it the feeling that this is for the, as you said before, the German folk, we have to stick together? How did this happen, this change?
It's a little bit of both. So the shift started earlier. So the German economy was at the bottom when Hitler's regime took over. And the role of the woman was actually a nice talking about point to him, because there were a lot of people without work. So the idea of, okay, let's keep the women at home so the men can find work, so we have some work for the men, was actually a sentiment or thought that was well received within the German community.
Okay.
And also, even though we had all these progressive thoughts from the Weimar Republic and women being at work and doing different things and doing more than just raising children and bearing children, the general social idea was still that the predominantly caretaker was the woman in the house. That was still a fact. So this shift wasn't as radical as it was, and it was also helped by propaganda. So the teaching of motherhood within Nazi Germany was for sure nature-based, as we need the mother, and the conservative thing, like it's the role of the mother. But it was more than that. There was a very spiritual component, like it's God's power for the women to bear children. And the functional aspect was really hammered home within these women and being like, this is your function to bear children. You're the generator of race. It was really, the motherhood was taught or was seen as a job. It was recognized within society, and the Nazis really capitalized on femininity and the capability to bear children. I stumbled upon an excerpt or a book from Kirkpatrick, a US scholar who visited Germany in the 1930s, and he wrote about the German women during the Nazi regime, that a woman's life is fully and socially useful only when her children are strong, healthy, intelligent, and racially pure.
Pretty mind-blowing, yeah, that's right.
That's obviously horrifying to hear today, but it's also so straightforward. The women in that role of mother were completely reduced to their function to bear children. And that directly related as well to the role of the housewife, which was also seen as a valued role, you can see that domestic work was propagated to impact the national economy even.
What do you mean by that, sorry?
The Nazi propagated that the women working at home, that what's happening in the household is a benefit to the whole community, to the national economy. It's equal to a person or just to a man doing a regular job.
Right, understood. Okay. Being in a factory or whatnot, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's actually went that far that some women leaders within the Nazi regime supposed that if the job of a woman is so important and is seen to be as equal of a benefit for the system, then maybe we should get paid, or the women should get paid.
Oh.
Obviously, that didn't happen.
Right.
But these very, very progressive thoughts well, actually, they were the consequence of these teachings of women having a job, and the job is being at home and raising children. Bearing children.
Bearing children, exactly. Okay, so that's a very succinct way that you put it together there. That was clearly seen as the concept of the role of a woman and the concept of marriage. Were there laws and policies, though, that were then changed? I'm guessing it wasn't just... we say that this is now what's happening and this is then simply gets done. Rather, there were tweaks or even large amendments to the law to kind of back up these policies.
Yeah, so the role of marriage and women were almost the same. So actually, they were the same. Healthy, and then, excuse my terminology again, purebred children. That was the task. Women had to bear them, and marriage had to provide the structure for women to bear them, because at that time, children were predominantly born in marriages, and children born out of wedlock were societally frowned upon, and legally also had very different rights and of a lower status. For example, just to give you a bigger picture, children born out of wedlock, there was the concept or the legal care concept wasn't parental rights. It was guardianship.
Ah, okay. Can you maybe elaborate what you mean by that?
At that time, the German legal system, or the way the parental-child relationship was determined, was by marriage, whether the child was born within a marriage or not.
So if the mother wasn't the parent, it was rather the guardian, the legal guardian.
Exactly. Okay. So the mother was recognized as a person of interest to the child,
okay.
But she didn't have parental rights, as we call them today.
Yes, understood.
She was mostly tasked with the care of the children, with the physical care.
Yes.
A guardian was tasked with the legal aspect.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so how you can see marriage, like the task of marriage and women in the law and the rules. So the Nazis took on a really pragmatic perspective. And it can be boiled down to marriages were useful and of interest if it produced healthy children. And if not, there was no interest. So it was very much that marriage law was directed by this one prerogative, and that was we need more children and we need purebred children, obviously, from the anti-Semitic and really eugenic and terrible. I think these rules, it's terrifying to read them today. But in the way of we need more children, a law was introduced, just to give you one or two examples.
Yeah,
so the law to reduce unemployment from 1933, that organized a marriage loan if the woman stayed at home and behind closed...
Would receive money then from the government, or...?
Exactly. Okay. They would receive money from the government if the woman stayed at home, took care of the children. And the idea was if the woman stayed at home anyway, then she could just have more children.
Ah, I see. Children breeding children, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another thing you can see is the relevance of infertility within marriage law. So the Nazis introduced health certificates as a requirement to wed. One of the reasons was to secure marriages and also the physical unions only with people they deemed useful and desirable.
Okay.
And that was aimed on one side against Jewish people, but also against people with hereditary and psychological illnesses. And these health certificates, you could only acquire them if you were able to bear children. And the concept was that Nazis approved of unions of people with equal outsets. So a person that the Nazis deemed not useful to be in a marriage could be in a marriage with another person that was not useful in a marriage.
Okay.
So people with hereditary illnesses could wed people that were infertile.
So almost a caste system, almost.
Exactly.
Okay. And did both men and women have to apply for these licenses? Yes. Okay. So it was there was no sexism in that regard. It was both had to apply for the license. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. It's, as you say, a very, very different understanding of our modern concept of marriage.
Yeah, completely. It's just function.
Purely function. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the other thing, which was then like the next step, was the marriage law that was introduced in 1938, where the whole marriage law in German law was revisited and rewritten by the Nazis. Actually, the reluctance to procreate was a reason for divorce, as well as infertility in general.
Oh,
so you could just walk up to the judge and be like, hey, my partner is infertile. I don't want this anymore. Okay. And then you're out. And that
annulled the marriage. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Gosh. Insane when we hear it today. In many ways, what I find so fascinating about it is the things that I never really gave a thought to in the smaller detail. You have the bigger picture, the war going on, but actually what this means in communities, in households, these policies, the way they worked. And that maybe is a question then about, did they actually work? Did they lead to more children being born? And if so, what happened kind of once war started in earnest in 1939?
Hitler's regime took to power in 1933, and we have numbers from that year that the number of children born was under 1 million. Mm-hmm. So in comparison, 20 years earlier, in 1913, it was 1.8 million children being born.
Oh, so almost halved.
Yeah, exactly. And Hitler's regime took over, and that's also why these population growth perspective was really strong within the system, and also the drive towards war also.
Yes.
And we have numbers that by 1937, the number of children born actually rose up to 1.3 million again. Okay. It wasn't quite the 1.8 from before, but you can see the steep climb.
The policies definitely played a role then.
Yeah. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we don't really have more information during the times of war, so from 1939 onwards, and only after the World War, but you can see that even today, these numbers never really recovered.
Okay.
But what you can see that in order to still achieve population growth and just to keep the numbers up, popular Nazi leaders actually propagated the birth of children outside of marriage later on in the war.
Okay, even though they were previously seen as not overly welcome, children were born outside of wedlock, but then things got more desperate towards the end of the war.
Exactly. There's then no surprise that these ideas weren't really successful, because they were, as you said, completely contrary towards the ideology from before, and also the conservative and Christian belief of the women. So the 180 degrees they did there completely went against the indoctrination of the women they had achieved before.
Okay, yes.
So that wasn't really popular. Women just didn't do it. Mm-hmm. But it was really interesting to see.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a quick break now, and then I'll come back and I'll talk with you a little bit more about raising children.
Max Planck Law is a network of Max Planck Institutes engaging in legal research. The first of these was established in Berlin in 1924. Today, we cover a broad range of legal studies, from the anthropology of law to tax law. We operate one of the world's largest programs for doctoral and postdoctoral research in law. Visit our website today at law.mpg.de.
Well, welcome back to the Lawcast. My guest today is Lara Bucholski from the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and International Private Law in Hamburg. Lara, before the break, we talked about women in Nazi Germany and marriage, and you stated there that, at least according to Nazi ideology, the primary role of women was to birth children. This obviously changed somewhat when war began. Men were on the front, women had to go to factories. However, Hitler had increased the number of births prior to World War II. Who then became responsible for the upbringing of this growing number of children?
Actually, the care and protection of young people was seen as a matter of the community. So while obviously the parents were also tasked with raising their children, And it was their duty to protect them and just to give them a good head start and also start the indoctrination within the Nazi ideology. The education was more and more state-led within the Nazi regime. So we are talking about these state-approved institutions like Hitler Youth, the League of German Girls, and those were then basically taking over the day-to-day care for the children. And on another note, you have to see that while Hitler was aiming to also use the women in warfare, it was mostly for those women of a higher class. It was really easy to just not go to a doctor and say, like, I'm not capable of going to the war front. I have to stay home.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't hugely popular because the indoctrination of the woman that happened before as a mother and housewife was so strong that this shift wasn't really that well received.
Okay, a shift to working in factories or moving closer to the front to support the troops.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, right. But how early then did this kind of Nazi indoctrination of the children begin? What were the key messages that were conveyed?
It started at home and then continued on within the state-led organizations. So parents were tasked to raise their children in the spirit of National Socialism and to serve the people in the German community. Mm-hmm. That was the educational goal that was set by the Nazis. And to ensure this goal at the early stage where the children were primarily cared for by their parents, there you can see in the law there's an expansion of power of the courts in regards to the intervention in parental rights. The clause is 1666 German Civil Code. We still have it today, not in this form, but it still exists. And that clause was amended to allow further oversight and state intervention. And that intervention was so extensive and at an early stage that the state could just take away the parental rights or just heavily infringe of them if the educational goals were objectively jeopardized. And objectively, meaning here, obviously, from a Nazi point of view.
That's right. The indoctrination was being jeopardized.
Exactly. So even while the parents were still tasked with caring for the children, there was heavy state oversight. Then the next step was then the education and the upbringing within these Nazi-controlled organizations. So the Hitler Youth started at 14, but there were pre-groups for boys that started at 10, as early as 10, and the same for girls. And indoctrination, or this general, the education within National Socialism ideology and the spirit of National Socialism also happened at school.
Right. So they were surrounded by basically this indoctrination at home, at school, in their free time.
Yeah.
There's one photo which was kind of stuck in my mind from towards the end of the Second World War, where there's a very weary, tired Hitler kind of shaking hands with children in Berlin these were children, probably 10 years old, who'd been fighting Soviets on the Eastern Front. I guess this shows, one, the abysmal state of the German army at that point in time. It was probably weeks, if not days, before the capitulation. But I'd also like to ask, and as you say, with this indoctrination at home, at school, in the free time, I mean, this must have had a massive impact on the lives of these children.
Absolutely. I mean, they were set on a path from the very beginning. Even if you look towards the beginning of the regime, I mean, in the beginning, it was voluntary to be in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls.
Okay.
By 1936, these were official state-recognized institutions.
Oh, so only really at the very, very beginning was voluntarily. It became compulsory
so in the very
soon. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in the very beginning, it was voluntary. Then it evolved towards a state-recognized institution where they were recognized even within society as an official educational authority under public law.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1939, it was mandatory. So, and at that point, that meant from 10 to 14, the children were the pre-groups, so Deutsches Jugendvolk for the boys, and 14 to 18, Hitler Youth for the boys, and the same for the girls, 10 to 14 and 14 to 18.
Okay.
And immediately after that, these were the next groups or next organizations. So they were just handed from one organization to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And after Hitler Youth, there was an entry either into paramilitary or military service, or interest groups and party-affiliated groups within the NSDAP and the Nazi regime. And then the next step, or the other step, was government-led groups. SRSS.
Yes.
So there was a really preset course for these children.
Pathway for these children, yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And you have to imagine the mandatory membership in these groups that was upheld by like imprisonment and punishment if these young people were prevented from joining. So the prevention of a young person to serve was punished with imprisonment and other punishment, fines or...
Okay, yeah. Not to mention probably being ostracized as the parents and having the children taken away from you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was really structured and...
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy to see that they were caught up in this machinery and there was basically no escape. On the other hand, how did it look for the children? So in the beginning, obviously, there were leisure activities, music lessons, horse riding, cooking, camps, excursions.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really strong principle that youth was led by youth. But on the other side, these groups also had really strong paramilitary elements of physical drill, of just general fitness. And you can actually see that the Nazi leader in charge of the youth programs, he wrote in 1933, so 6 years before the start of the war, he wrote, "The rifle must come as naturally to them as the pen." So that was really, while on the one side they had nice activities, community. On the other hand, it was very much structured towards we're building up a military.
That's right. There was a clear goal in mind there. Wow. It's a topic for another podcast, but that would be, I think, very interesting to also see how these children developed post-war and to see how everything that they had learned and, as you say, been drilled into them suddenly had gone up in smoke.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had to think about what you said at the beginning of the question, that these pictures stuck to your mind. And I actually have a number. I think it's around 60 to 70,000 young children in the ages 14 to 18 that died in the end for Hitler. Mm-hmm. And that's an insane number for people actually being underaged.
That's right, 100%.
And they died as soldiers. So that's it's not civilian casualties.
That's right. They're actually children sent to the front to fight and die.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're drawing, I guess, towards the end of today's episode. So I wanted to now, we've talked a lot about the past. We started with the present, went to the past, and I'd like to come back to the present. You've touched on the fact that post-World War II, the laws are obviously changed. There's a lot of all this denazification, also the judiciary and the law in the books. But you mentioned that not everything was removed. Certain elements still are found today. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So, as you said, all of the laws were denazified, meaning that the racial aspect, the discriminatory aspect, these like the atrocities that could be found in law, they were removed, obviously. But the marriage law that was introduced by the Nazis from 1938, that actually stayed in effect until the 1980s.
Okay. It seems rather strange.
It seems rather strange, but by looking at the text of the law, you see that while there was obviously changes made by the Nazis, some of them were denazified, so we lost them along the way, but it also upheld like other ideas from the area pre the Nazi regime.
Okay. There's a law that had been in place pre-1933. Okay.
Yeah. And just to give you an example, something that actually the Nazis brought to us was leaving the concept of culpability in divorce law behind. So before the law of 1938, divorces could only happen when one party was culpable of something. Okay.
Other than infertility, obviously.
Other than that, that's...
yes.
Yeah, but just in general. And that's something that was also implemented way before the Nazi regime took over. So the idea that you could only leave your marriage behind if you were culpable of something, that was, for that time, the marriage law was very hard fought over in the Weimar Republic and after the civil code took effect in Germany. It was very... critically seen.
Yes.
One side was it's not liberal enough, the other one is it's not conservative enough. The women at that time, so pre-regime, were actually trying to achieve this letting go of the culpability clause for their own gain because it was easier for the men to prove the woman guilty of something. And it was also on the other side hard for the women to prove the men being guilty of something.
It was more difficult for them to leave a marriage.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and the Nazis introduced this non-culpability clause as a rule to allow flexibility in divorce law. And this flexibility was then seen later, after the regime and after the denazification, it was actually seen as something that's serving the interests and personal interests of the divorcees and of the two people within the marriage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was something that was thought about and said, it may have been enacted by the Nazis at the time, but if we denazify the passage itself, there is a good reason to keep it today.
Exactly. And another thing that remained untouched for a really long time was 1666. So the clause I talked about, the intervention within the parental rights by the states.
Yes.
And that stayed that way so long was actually, it's crazy to think about, because after the Second World War and after the regime, the general idea in law was to reduce state power and to reduce possibility to intervene in the private sphere. Mm-hmm. And that clause still allowed for that. And it was then only changed a long time later, so by 1980, and was amended to only ensure the well-being of the child.
And was that a clause that had simply escaped notice, or was there a reason why it was hung on to?
Yeah, it was. I think you can see people criticizing holding on to that clause. The change happened at a point in time where, in general, the safety of the child and the well-being of a child was a hot topic in Germany. And the whole relationship between parents and children changed in 1980 when the parental rights, which we in Germany was for a really long time called elterliche Gewalt, so the parental power, parental might probably, was switched toward parental care.
I see. Okay, so it was a reform, an overall reform that then
basically sacked that clause as well.
Okay, so Lara, we've obviously talked a lot now about how the law was, over a span of 100 years, instrumentalized, twisted, changed to serve various purposes, particularly during the Nazi regime. What would you say that these findings and what you've learned about the topic, or how would you sum them up? What can one take from them?
On a personal note, heartbreaking and terrifying is probably very accurate. On the other hand, on a more technical aspect, on my findings, for me, it's crazy to see how the modification of law was only one of the last steps within that regime. So the main change was actually achieved by a change in public's opinion and point of view, especially the role of the women was modified long before it was evident on paper. That's just something that's crazy to see. And for me as a legal scholar or just a legal researcher and a prospect lawyer, it's to see that my job is also at some point just a reflection of what's happened within the society.
The law changes after the fact.
Exactly. And it is obviously really reassuring to see how the role of women and children have changed and which steps we have taken towards equality and autonomy. I'm also reminded by these findings that the safeguards we have today and to assure the status quo are only as stable as those upholding them. You can see that the changes that were made by the Nazis, in contrast to those progressive thoughts of women in the society in the Weimar Republic. So something that's taken for granted today mustn't be taken for granted tomorrow. The last thing that I found interesting was to see that the law is rarely truly neutral. I touched upon it when we were talking about the value-based jurisprudence. So with that, the Nazi regime was able to influence and modify the existing law to their advantage. And it kind of showed that while one can phrase law as precise as possible, as extensive power will remain with those applying the rules. That kind of stuck with me.
Absolutely, that's right. No, I think that your answer provides a stark reminder of the importance of critical thinking, collective responsibility when, safeguarding us from the brutality of history repeating itself. So, Lara, thank you very much for the talk today. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming on the show, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be talking about my findings and these topics.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I wish you the very best of luck for your future research, and I'd like to have you back on the Lawcast sometime in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.